I ain't much of a storyteller, but here's something I can't seem to shake off. It all happened a few weeks ago when I, an introverted nerd, decided to step out of my comfort zone and go on a blind date. You know, the kind you hear about in movies. Well, it turned out to be a story I wish I'd never lived through. It was a regular Wednesday evening, the sun setting just right, casting a golden hue on everything it touched. I had spent hours picking the right shirt, fixing my hair just so, trying to look presentable for this date. My heart raced as I pulled into the parking lot of a roadside diner. The place had that vintage vibe, a mix of nostalgia and simplicity that seemed comforting. Walking in, I could feel the eyes of strangers on me. I was used to being the quiet guy in the background, so this was a bit overwhelming. I saw her sitting at a corner booth, our designated spot. She was beautiful, with a radiant smile that put my nerves at ease. We exchanged pleasantries, and for a while, everything seemed fine. The diner was buzzing with activity, the lunch hour rush in full swing. We laughed, shared stories, and the conversation flowed better than I could have hoped. But as the minutes ticked by, I noticed a man a few tables away. He seemed agitated, his eyes darting around like he was searching for something. My date didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. I chalked it up to nerves and tried to focus on our conversation. But then, things took a dark turn. Out of nowhere, the man's gaze locked onto our booth. It was like his eyes bore into mine, cold and piercing. He got up and began to approach us, his steps deliberate and purposeful. I stammered, trying to ask my date if she knew him, but before I could get the words out, he was right there, standing over us. His face was contorted, twisted with anger or something even more sinister. He started muttering under his breath, words that made no sense. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand on end as a shiver ran down my spine. My date looked just as terrified as I felt. And then, in an instant, he lunged at her. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. He grabbed her by the throat, his fingers digging into her skin, cutting off her scream. I tried to pull him away, but it was like he had supernatural strength. His eyes were no longer his own. They were wild, filled with a malevolent force that I can't describe. The diner erupted into chaos as people scrambled to help. I could hear their cries, their shouts, but it was all a blur. It was like time stood still and all I could focus on was this man, possessed by some unknown entity, snuffing out the life from my date. Eventually, a group of customers managed to overpower him and pull him away, but it was too late for her. She lay there, lifeless, her eyes staring blankly ahead. The paramedics arrived, but there was nothing they could do. The shock, the horror, it all felt unreal. The police came, questions were asked, statements given, but no one could explain what had happened. The man, the possessed man, was taken away in cuffs, his vacant gaze locked on me until he disappeared from view. I still can't shake off the feeling of dread that settled over me that day. I can't forget the look in that man's eyes, the pure evil that seemed to possess him. It's a story I wish I could erase from my memory, a nightmarish experience that shattered my world. So here I am, sharing this tale with you all, hoping that somehow someone out there can make sense of it. Maybe you'll pass it off as a crazy story, but for me it's a chilling reminder that there are forces out there beyond our understanding, waiting to pounce when we least expect it.
It's a story that still haunts my dreams, a chilling encounter that happened just a few weeks back. You see, I'm just an ordinary mother trying to raise my 3-year-old toddler in this crazy world. But that fateful day, something happened that I can't quite explain. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind that tempts you to step out and enjoy the warmth. My little one was in tow, his tiny hand clutching mine as we strolled along the sidewalk near a roadside diner. I could feel his excitement, his curious eyes taking in every little detail. As we neared the diner, I noticed a strange crowd of people gathered just across the street. My maternal instincts kicked in, and I felt this nagging urge to investigate. I mean, who wouldn't be curious, right? So I tightened my grip on my son's hand and cautiously made our way towards the commotion. The diner's entrance was bustling with activity. Police cars lined the curb, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the scene. My heart raced as I saw officers ushering a man into one of the squad cars, his face twisted with a mix of anger and confusion. I couldn't help but wonder what had transpired inside. Strangers mumbled amongst themselves, their hushed voices creating a symphony of curiosity and fear. I positioned myself at the edge of the crowd, my little one clutching my leg as he gazed up at me with wide, innocent eyes. And that's when I saw her, a woman, her lifeless form being carried out on a stretcher by paramedics. A chill ran down my spine as I looked upon the tragedy before me. I couldn't help but think of my own child, the fragility of life and how it can be snuffed out in an instant. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. As I stood there, lost in my thoughts, a voice suddenly pierced through the murmurs of the crowd. It was a man's voice, low and guttural, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I glanced around, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Release me," the voice hissed, the words sending a shiver down my spine. It was as if the very air around me had turned icy. My grip on my son tightened, and I scanned the faces around me, searching for any sign of who had spoken those unsettling words. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the voice faded away. The crowd continued to mill about, seemingly oblivious to what I had just experienced. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I had to get my son out of there. I turned to leave, my steps quickening, but as I glanced back over my shoulder, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man, the one they had just arrested, was staring right at me. His eyes bore into mine, a sinister glint that sent a jolt of terror through my veins. It was like he could see right through me, like he knew the fear that had taken root in my heart. I hurried away, my son in my arms, not daring to look back again. The voice, the man's haunting gaze, it all seemed like something out of a nightmare. And even though I made it home safely, I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever had happened inside that roadside diner was far from over. So there you have it, my friends, a tale that defies explanation and still gives me chills when I think about it. It's a reminder that there are forces beyond our understanding, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be unleashed. And as for that possessed man, well, I pray that he remains behind bars where he can't harm anyone else. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that he's escaped from more than just handcuffs that day. He's escaped from something much darker and more sinister.
In the heart of the city, nestled among the dimly lit alleys and forgotten corners, a place frequented by vagrants and homeless souls stood as a silent witness to their struggles and sorrows. A roadside diner, its neon signs casting an eerie glow on the desolate streets, served as a makeshift refuge for those who had nowhere else to turn. On a moonless night, when the shadows seemed to stretch infinitely, a man shuffled through the alleyways towards this haven of the forsaken. His steps were cautious, his eyes darting about as if searching for some glimmer of hope in the darkness. He was one of them, a fellow vagrant, familiar with the harsh realities that life on the streets entailed. As he neared the diner, he caught sight of a small gathering of figures. Huddled together beneath the flickering streetlight, they whispered among themselves, their faces etched with a mix of fear and curiosity. Something was amiss, and the air was thick with tension. His curiosity piqued. The man approached the group, his heart beating a little faster. Among the small gathering, his eyes fell upon a scene that would haunt his nightmares for nights to come. A fellow homeless man, a face he recognized but whose name he never knew, lay on the ground, writhing and screaming in a way that sent chills down his spine. The tormented man's limbs twisted and contorted, as if under the influence of some unseen force. His voice carried the weight of anguish, a cry that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the night. The man's heart ached at the sight, a mixture of empathy and dread washing over him. He watched helplessly, his mind racing to comprehend the horror unfolding before him. Other vagrants stood at a distance, their eyes wide with a mix of shock and fear. None dared to approach, to offer aid to the suffering man, as if some invisible barrier kept them at bay. It was as if the very air was charged with an otherworldly energy, a force that none could defy. Despite the unease that gnawed at his gut, a strange compulsion drew the man forward. He found himself stepping closer, the ground beneath his feet feeling unsteady. Kneeling down beside the writhing man, he felt a surge of helplessness wash over him. He wanted to offer solace, to share in the burden of the man's pain. And then he noticed it, a glimmer of light in the man's outstretched hand. It was a coin, dull and tarnished, yet it seemed to radiate an unnatural energy. The symbols etched onto its surface held an unworldly allure, drawing his gaze like a moth to flame. In a moment of instinct, his fingers closed around the coin, and as they made contact, a jolt of energy surged through him. The suffering man's screams grew louder, more desperate, their intensity matching the turmoil within the man's contorted form. The man felt a shiver crawl down his spine, his heart pounding as he tried to let go of the coin.
But it was as if his very muscles had betrayed him, as if he was bound to the cursed object by some invisible force.
A sinister realization dawned upon him. He was becoming a part of this nightmare, a puppet in a malevolent dance. The writhing man's screams began to subside, his body going limp, and as the man's vacant eyes locked onto his own, a wave of terror washed over him. The presence of an unknown force invaded his mind, a malevolent entity that seemed to slither through his thoughts. His very essence felt like it was being infiltrated by something ancient and sinister, a darkness that sought to consume him from within. The world around him seemed to distort, the alleyway darkening as an eerie energy enveloped him. His body twitched and convulsed, his senses overwhelmed by the malevolent force that had taken hold. He was no longer himself. He was a vessel, a conduit for something far more powerful and terrifying than anything he could have imagined. And there, in the shadows of that forsaken alleyway, a transformation was complete. The man who had sought to offer compassion and aid had become ensnared in a nightmare beyond his comprehension. The cursed coin, once held by a tormented soul, had now claimed another victim, its dark power solidifying its hold. So, my friends, as you listen to this tale, remember the haunted alleyways, the suffering souls, and the relentless forces that lurk in the shadows. Beware the whispers in the dark, for they may lead you down a path from which there is no escape.